Sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the loudest secrets. What happens when 9 military recruits think they've found an easy target, only to discover they've cornered someone whose silence wasn't weakness, but the calm before a storm that would change their lives forever? This is the true story of Maya Chun, a woman whose past was written in scars and whose future was about to be rewritten by a single tattoo that revealed everything. The rain hammered against the windows of the military recruitment center in downtown Seattle as Maya Chun sat perfectly still in the corner chair, her small frame almost disappearing into the oversized furniture. Her dark hair fell like a curtain around her face, and she hadn't spoken a word to anyone since arriving 3 hours ago. The other recruits had tried to make conversation at first, but her complete silence had eventually driven them away, leaving her isolated in her chosen corner. At 24, Maya looked younger than her years, with delicate features that seemed almost fragile in the harsh fluorescent lighting. She wore a simple black hoodie and jeans, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would make her stand out. But there was something about her stillness that was different from shyness or nervousness. It was the kind of quiet that comes from someone who has learned that speaking up can be dangerous. The 9 other recruits had been growing restless as the day wore on. They were all young men, fresh out of high school or college, full of energy and bravado that came with the decision to join the military. They had bonded quickly over shared stories of why they were enlisting, dreams of serving their country, and nervous jokes about basic training. Maya's silence had become an irritant to them, a puzzle they couldn't solve and, increasingly, a target for their growing frustration. "Hey you," called out Tyler Morrison, a tall blonde kid from Texas who had appointed himself the unofficial leader of the group. "You deaf or something? We've been trying to talk to you all day." Maya didn't respond. She kept her eyes fixed on her hands, which were folded carefully in her lap. Her breathing remained steady and controlled, as if she had perfected the art of becoming invisible while still being physically present. "Maybe she doesn't speak English," suggested Marcus Williams, a stocky kid from Detroit who had been bouncing his leg nervously for the past hour. "A lot of immigrants trying to get citizenship through military service these days." "She looks Asian," added Connor Hughes, squinting at Maya as if she were a specimen under a microscope. "Probably doesn't understand what we're saying." The comments grew more pointed as the minutes ticked by. What started as curious observations evolved into something uglier, fueled by boredom, nerves, and the pack mentality that can emerge when young men feel the need to establish dominance in a new social hierarchy. "I bet she's never even been in a fight," scoffed Jake Peterson, shadow boxing in the air. "Look at those tiny arms. What's she gonna do in combat? Hide behind everyone else." "Maybe that's her strategy," laughed Derek Collins. "Be so quiet the enemy doesn't notice her." Maya's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she remained motionless. In her mind, she was somewhere else entirely. She was back in the mountains of Afghanistan, where silence had meant survival, where the wrong word, the wrong movement, the wrong breath could mean death not just for her, but for the entire unit depending on her intelligence gathering, where she had learned to disappear into the shadows and emerge only when it was time to strike. But they didn't know that. They couldn't know that. The recruitment office was understaffed that day due to a training conference, leaving only one harried clerk trying to process paperwork for dozens of potential recruits. The delays had stretched what should have been a quick medical and aptitude testing day into a marathon of waiting, and patience was running thin all around. "I'm going to go talk to her," announced Brad Kowalski, standing up and cracking his knuckles. "See if we can get some kind of reaction." "Leave her alone, man," said Tommy Rodriguez quietly. He was the only one among them who seemed uncomfortable with the direction things were heading. "She's not bothering anybody." "That's exactly the problem," Brad shot back. "We're all going to be serving together, probably end up in the same unit. I want to know who I'm going to be fighting next to. Right now, all I see is dead weight." Maya's breathing changed, becoming deeper and more controlled. It was a breathing pattern she had learned during her time with the SEALs, designed to keep her heart rate steady and her mind clear when situations turned dangerous. She could feel the energy in the room shifting, could sense the way the group was positioning itself around her chair, cutting off potential escape routes. They thought they were cornering a frightened girl. They had no idea they were surrounding a trained operator who had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan and had more confirmed kills than any of them could imagine. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Brad demanded, now standing directly in front of Maya's chair. It's disrespectful to ignore people who are trying to be friendly. For the first time all day, Maya lifted her head. Her dark eyes met Brad's, and, for just a moment, something flickered across her face that made him take an involuntary step backward. It was there, and gone so quickly he wasn't sure he had really seen it. But, for that instant, her gaze had been absolutely lethal. "Oh, so you can hear," Brad said, recovering his composure and leaning closer. "You just think you're too good to talk to us regular folks?" The other 8 recruits had formed a loose semicircle around Maya's chair now, blocking her view of the rest of the waiting room. To anyone glancing over casually, it might have looked like a group of friends having a conversation. But Maya could read the body language, could see the aggressive posturing, could feel the testosterone and frustration building to a dangerous level. She had been in situations like this before, but those had been in war zones, where the rules of engagement were clear and lethal force was not only authorized, but expected. This was different. These were American kids who had no idea what they were dealing with. Kids who thought military service was going to be an adventure. Kids who had never seen real violence or understood its consequences. "Maybe she's scared," suggested Tyler, moving closer. "Maybe she's realizing she made a mistake trying to join up with the big boys." "I don't think women should be in combat roles anyway," added Marcus. "They're not built for it. Too emotional, too weak." Maya's hands remained folded in her lap, but her muscles began to coil like springs. Every instinct she had developed over years of combat training was telling her to neutralize the threats surrounding her, to use the element of surprise while she still had it, to strike fast and hard before they could react. But she held herself back. These weren't enemy combatants. They were just stupid kids who didn't know any better. "You know what I think?" Brad said, leaning down so his face was level with hers. "I think you're afraid. I think you walked in here thinking this was going to be easy, and now you're realizing you're in over your head." Maya's eyes flicked to each of the 9 young men surrounding her, calculating distances, identifying weapons of opportunity, mapping out the fastest way to disable each of them. It was an automatic process, as natural to her as breathing. Chair legs could be broken off and used as clubs. The corner of the heavy wooden table could crush a larynx with the right amount of force. The coffee pot on the side table was still hot enough to cause serious burns. She could have all 9 of them on the ground and unconscious in under 30 seconds. "Cat got your tongue?" Derek taunted. "Or maybe you just don't have anything interesting to say." Maya's right hand moved slightly, her fingers positioning themselves in a way that would allow her to grab the pressure point on Brad's wrist if he came any closer. It was such a small movement that none of them noticed, but it was the first indication that her legendary patience was finally beginning to wear thin. "I bet she's never even held a gun before," Jake said with a laugh. "Probably thinks the army is like summer camp or something." If they only knew, Maya thought to herself. If they only knew about the confirmed sniper kills from over 1,000 meters. If they only knew about the close-quarters combat operations where she had emerged as the only survivor. If they only knew about the classified missions that had prevented terrorist attacks on American soil. But they didn't know, and she couldn't tell them. The problem was that her silence, which had been a tactical advantage in so many dangerous situations, was now working against her. These kids were interpreting her quiet demeanor as weakness, her small stature as vulnerability, her calm breathing as fear. They had no way of knowing that her silence was the calm before the storm. "Maybe we should help her practice," Tyler suggested with a mean grin. "You know, get her ready for what real military life is going to be like." "Yeah," agreed Connor. "Show her what it's like when people are actually trying to intimidate you." Maya's pulse remained steady, but her mental calculations were becoming more precise. Brad was the immediate threat, standing closest to her with his hands clenched into fists. Tyler and Marcus were positioned to her left, blocking the path to the door. Jake and Derek had moved behind her chair, eliminating her rear escape route. She was completely surrounded, just the way she liked it. In her mind, she was back in Kandahar, in a Taliban compound where she had been captured during a reconnaissance mission. She had been outnumbered 12-1 in that concrete room, with zip tie restraints cutting into her wrists and a bag over her head. The Taliban fighters had thought they had caught an easy prisoner, someone they could interrogate and then execute for propaganda purposes. They had been wrong. Maya had killed all 12 of them with her bare hands and escaped with intelligence that led to the destruction of an entire terrorist cell. The CIA had classified the entire incident, and officially, it had never happened. "You know what?" Brad said, reaching out to grab Maya's chin and force her to look at him. "I think you need to learn some respect." That was when Maya moved. Brad's hand never reached her face. Instead, she caught his wrist in a grip that made him gasp in pain, her thumb finding the precise pressure point that would send shooting agony up his entire arm. In the same fluid motion, she stood up from the chair, using Brad's suddenly unbalanced position to pull him forward and off his feet. But even as every combat instinct screamed at her to continue the attack, to disable the threat, and secure the area, Maya forced herself to stop. She released Brad's wrist and stepped back, her hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. Brad stumbled backward, shaking his hand and staring at Maya with a mixture of shock and confusion. The pain had been incredible, like nothing he had ever experienced, but it had lasted only a few seconds. "What the hell was that?" he demanded. But his voice lacked the confidence it had held moments before. Maya looked around at the 9 faces surrounding her, seeing confusion, surprise, and the first glimmerings of respect. For just a moment, she had given them a tiny glimpse of what lay beneath her quiet exterior, just enough to make them reconsider their assumptions. "How did you do that?" Tommy asked, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier discomfort with the situation. Maya sat back down in her chair and folded her hands in her lap, returning to the same position she had held for hours. Her breathing was still perfectly controlled, her expression still calm and unreadable. But something had changed. The dynamic in the room had shifted in a way that none of them fully understood yet. "Did you take karate or something?" Marcus asked, his earlier bravado replaced by wary interest. Maya didn't respond, but Brad was still flexing his fingers, trying to work feeling back into his hand. Whatever she had done to him had been precise, controlled, and devastatingly effective. It wasn't the kind of technique you learned in a weekend self-defense class. "That was some serious stuff," Derek said quietly. "Where did you learn to do that?" For the first time since arriving at the recruitment center, Maya spoke. Her voice was quiet, but clear, with no trace of fear or uncertainty. "I didn't learn it," she said simply. "I lived it." The 9 recruits exchanged glances, trying to process what they had just witnessed and what her words might mean. The girl they had dismissed as weak and frightened had just demonstrated a level of skill that none of them possessed, and her cryptic response only added to the mystery. "What does that mean?" Tyler asked, his earlier aggression replaced by genuine curiosity. Maya looked at each of them in turn, her dark eyes revealing nothing. In her mind, she was weighing her options, trying to decide how much she could afford to reveal without compromising operational security or violating the non-disclosure agreements she had signed with the military. "It means," she said finally, "that things aren't always what they seem." Before any of them could respond, a door opened at the far end of the waiting room, and a uniformed sergeant emerged with a clipboard. "Next group for medical processing," he called out. "Morrison, Williams, Hughes, Peterson, Collins, Kowalski, Rodriguez, Chun, and the rest of you. Let's move." Maya stood up smoothly and walked toward the sergeant, leaving the 9 confused recruits to follow behind her. As they walked down the hallway toward the medical examination rooms, she could feel their eyes on her back, could sense their whispered conversations and unanswered questions. They thought they had learned something about her in that waiting room, but they had only scratched the surface. The real revelations were still to come. The medical examination room was sterile and cold, with harsh white lights that made everyone look pale and sickly. The 10 recruits were separated into individual stations, each with a curtained cubicle where they would undergo the standard physical examination required for military service. Maya found herself assigned to Station 7, positioned between Marcus Williams and Connor Hughes, both of whom kept stealing glances at her while they waited for their turn with the medical staff. Dr. Elizabeth Hawkins was a veteran military physician who had seen thousands of recruits pass through her examination rooms over the past 15 years. She was efficient, professional, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot medical disqualifications before the recruits even removed their shirts. As she worked her way through the stations, she barely looked up from her clipboard, going through the motions of what had become a routine as familiar as breathing. When she reached Maya's station, she pulled back the curtain with the same brisk efficiency she had shown with all the others. Chun, Maya, she read from the clipboard. Age 24. Any current medications or medical conditions I should be aware of? No, ma'am, Maya replied quietly, beginning to remove her hoodie as instructed. Dr. Hawkins was already reaching for her stethoscope when Maya's shirt came off, revealing her back to the overhead lights. The doctor's hand froze halfway to her medical bag, and, for the first time all day, she looked up from her clipboard with genuine surprise. Maya's back was a roadmap of scars. There was a long, thin line that ran from her left shoulder blade to the middle of her spine, perfectly straight and obviously surgical. Below that were 3 small, circular scars that could only be bullet wounds, each one positioned in a way that should have been fatal. Along her right side were burn scars, the kind that came from shrapnel or explosive devices. And covering her lower back were dozens of smaller marks, some from cuts, some from impacts, all telling the story of violence survived. Jesus Christ, Dr. Hawkins whispered, her professional composure slipping for just a moment. Maya stood perfectly still, accustomed to this reaction. She had learned to ignore the shocked stares, the whispered questions, the inevitable assumptions that came with revealing the evidence of her past. But she could feel the attention of the other recruits in the nearby stations, could sense the way conversations were stopping as word spread about what the doctor had discovered. These are extensive, Dr. Hawkins said, recovering her professional demeanor but unable to keep the concern out of her voice. How did you sustain these injuries? Military service, Maya replied simply. You've already served? The doctor's confusion was evident. But your paperwork says this is your first enlistment. That's correct. Dr. Hawkins frowned, studying the scars more closely. She had seen combat injuries before, had treated soldiers returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, had patched up Marines who had been blown up by IEDs, and Rangers who had been shot by enemy snipers. But she had never seen anything quite like this on someone who was supposedly a new recruit. These injuries, she said carefully, they're consistent with multiple combat deployments. Some of them required major surgery. This one here, she pointed to the long surgical scar. This was serious spinal trauma. You should have been medically discharged. Maya's jaw tightened slightly, but she didn't respond. She couldn't explain that the spinal surgery had been performed by a CIA medical team in a black site facility in Eastern Europe. She couldn't mention that the bullet wounds had been sustained during a classified operation that officially never happened. She couldn't talk about the burns from the IED that had killed 3 other members of her team in a village that didn't exist on any map. Ma'am, Maya said carefully, I've been cleared for full duty by military medical personnel. If you need documentation, I can provide it. The problem was that all of her medical records were classified at levels that Dr. Hawkins didn't have clearance to access. As far as the standard military database was concerned, Maya Chun was a civilian with no prior military experience who was applying for her first enlistment. The contradiction between that official record and the evidence written across her skin was impossible to explain without revealing information that could get people killed. From the next station over, Marcus Williams was trying to crane his neck to see what was causing the delay. Everything okay over there, Doc? Turn around and mind your own business, Dr. Hawkins snapped, her years of military authority coming through in her voice. But even as she tried to maintain privacy for Maya's examination, she could see the other recruits whispering among themselves, their curiosity growing with each passing minute. Listen, the doctor said quietly, lowering her voice so only Maya could hear. I don't know what's going on here, but these injuries tell a story that doesn't match your paperwork. Some of these scars are recent, maybe 6 months old. Others go back years. This isn't the kind of damage you get from civilian life. Maya met the doctor's eye steadily. Ma'am, I understand your concern, but I'm fit for duty and ready to serve my country. Dr. Hawkins studied Maya's face, looking for some sign of deception or hidden agenda. What she saw instead was a calm certainty that was almost unsettling. This young woman wasn't nervous about the medical examination, wasn't worried about being disqualified, wasn't showing any of the normal anxiety that came with having extensive scarring examined by a stranger. It was the confidence of someone who had been through much worse. "Turn around, Dr. Hawkins instructed, and raise your arms." Maya complied, revealing even more scarring along her ribcage and abdomen. There were knife wounds, clearly defensive in nature, where she had fought off attackers in close quarters. There were impact marks from blunt force trauma, the kind that came from being beaten or thrown against hard surfaces. And along her left arm was a series of small, precise cuts that looked almost ritualistic. "What are these marks on your arm?" Dr. Hawkins asked, pointing to the series of small scars. "Counting marks," Maya replied without emotion. "Counting what?" Maya was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Confirmed kills." Dr. Hawkins felt a chill run down her spine. She had suspected that Maya's injuries were combat-related, but this revelation put everything in a different context. These weren't the scars of a victim or even a survivor. These were the marks of a predator, someone who had not only survived violence, but had excelled at it. How many? She found herself asking, even though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Maya turned to face the doctor, and, for just a moment, her carefully controlled mask slipped. In her eyes, Dr. Hawkins saw something that made her understand why this young woman carried herself with such quiet confidence. It wasn't arrogance or bravado. It was the absolute certainty of someone who had stared death in the face so many times that nothing in the civilian world could frighten her anymore. "Enough," Maya said simply. The examination continued in relative silence, with Dr. Hawkins going through the motions of checking blood pressure, heart rate, and reflexes. Everything was perfect, better than perfect actually. Maya's cardiovascular fitness was at the level of an elite athlete. Her reflexes were lightning fast, and her muscle tone suggested years of intensive physical training. But it was what happened during the flexibility test that really caught the doctor's attention. "I need you to demonstrate your range of motion," Dr. Hawkins instructed, starting with basic stretches. Maya moved through the requested positions with a fluid grace that was almost hypnotic to watch. But then, without being asked, she continued into movements that clearly demonstrated advanced martial arts training. Her kicks were precise and controlled, her balance was perfect, and when she transitioned into what looked like combat forms, Dr. Hawkins realized she was watching someone with skills far beyond anything taught in basic military training. "Where did you learn to move like that?" the doctor asked. "Special operations training," Maya replied, settling back into a relaxed standing position. "What unit?" Maya hesitated for just a moment, and Dr. Hawkins caught the hesitation. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but that's classified." Dr. Hawkins nodded slowly, beginning to understand the situation she was dealing with. Maya Chen wasn't a regular recruit. She was someone with a military background so classified that her records had been scrubbed clean, someone whose skills and experience were so sensitive that they couldn't be officially acknowledged. "One more thing," the doctor said, reaching for a small flashlight. "I need to check your eyes." Maya held perfectly still as the light moved back and forth, tracking the movement with the kind of precision that came from sniper training. Her pupils responded normally, but there was something about her gaze that was unsettling. It was the look of someone who had learned to see everything, to miss nothing, to identify threats before they became problems. "You can get dressed," Dr. Hawkins said finally, making notes on her clipboard that had nothing to do with standard medical observations. As Maya put her shirt back on, she could hear whispered conversations from the other stations. The word had spread quickly among the recruits about the extensive scarring, and speculation was running wild about what it might mean. "Did you see her back?" she heard Tyler whispering to someone. "Looked like she'd been in a war zone." "Maybe she was in an accident," suggested another voice. "Car crash or something." "Those weren't accident scars," came Marcus's voice, more serious than she had heard him before. "Those were combat injuries. I've seen enough military documentaries to know the difference." Dr. Hawkins finished her notes and looked up at Maya, who was now fully dressed and waiting patiently for dismissal. There were questions she wanted to ask, forms she probably should have filled out, protocols she was supposed to follow when dealing with recruits who had undisclosed military backgrounds. But something about Maya's calm demeanor, about the quiet authority she projected, told the doctor that those normal procedures didn't apply here. "You're cleared for all physical requirements," Dr. Hawkins said officially. Then, lowering her voice, she added, "But I have a feeling you already knew that." Maya nodded respectfully. "Thank you, ma'am." As Maya left the examination station, the other recruits watched her with a mixture of curiosity, respect, and wariness. The dynamic that had shifted in the waiting room had now changed completely. She was no longer the quiet girl they could intimidate or dismiss. She had become something else entirely, something they couldn't quite categorize or understand. But the real revelation was still to come. As the group waited for the final stages of their processing, Connor Hughes noticed something he had missed before. When Maya reached up to tie her hair back, the sleeve of her hoodie rode up slightly, revealing the edge of what looked like a tattoo on her upper arm. "Hey," he said, trying to sound casual. "Is that a tattoo?" Maya glanced down at her arm, realized what he had seen, and quickly pulled her sleeve back down. But it was too late. Connor had caught a glimpse of something that made his eyes widen with recognition. "Can we see it?" Jake asked, his earlier hostility replaced by genuine curiosity. Maya shook her head. "It's nothing interesting." But Marcus had also caught a glimpse of the marking, and his face had gone pale. As someone whose father was a retired Navy SEAL, he had grown up around special operations veterans. He knew what he had seen, even if he couldn't quite believe it. "That wasn't just any tattoo," he said quietly. "That was a trident." The other recruits looked confused, but Marcus was staring at Maya with something approaching awe. "A Navy SEAL trident," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The most exclusive tattoo in the military. You can't get one unless you've earned it." Maya's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes confirmed what Marcus had guessed. The 9 recruits who had cornered her in the waiting room, who had thought she was weak and frightened, who had assumed she was just another civilian trying to play soldier, were slowly beginning to understand exactly who they were dealing with. And they were about to find out that everything they thought they knew about Maya Chun was just the beginning of the story. The silence in the waiting area was different now, charged with an electricity that hadn't been there before. Marcus Williams sat staring at Maya with wide eyes, his mind racing as he tried to process what he thought he had seen. The other 8 recruits looked back and forth between them, sensing that something significant had happened but not understanding what. "What's a SEAL trident?" Tyler asked, breaking the tense quiet. Marcus turned to look at his new companions, his face still pale with shock. "The Navy SEAL trident is the warfare insignia that SEALs earn after completing their training. It's one of the hardest military qualifications to get in the world. Only about 25% of people who start SEAL training actually finish it." "So," Derek said with a shrug, "maybe she just got the tattoo because she thought it looked cool. People get military tattoos all the time without actually serving." But Marcus was shaking his head emphatically. "No, you don't understand. SEALs take that stuff seriously. Really seriously. If someone got a trident tattoo without earning it, and actual SEALs found out about it, that person would be in serious trouble. Like hospital-level trouble." Maya continued to sit quietly in her chair, but she was listening to every word of their conversation. She could see the wheels turning in Marcus's head, could watch as he connected the dots between the scars Dr. Hawkins had found, the combat skills she had demonstrated, and the brief glimpse of her tattoo. "But she's so small," Connor protested. "I mean, aren't SEALs supposed to be these huge, muscular guys? She looks like she weighs maybe 110 pounds. Some of the deadliest SEALs I've ever met were smaller guys," Marcus replied, his voice gaining confidence as he drew on his father's stories. "It's not about size. It's about mental toughness, technical skills, and the ability to think clearly under pressure." And he paused, looking directly at Maya. "Women have been serving in special operations for years now, even if it's not always publicized." Tommy Rodriguez, who had been the only one to speak up for Maya earlier, was studying her face intently. "Is it true?" he asked her directly. "Are you a SEAL?" Maya met his gaze steadily, weighing her options. Her cover identity was designed to withstand casual scrutiny, but It was starting to unravel under the focused attention of these recruits. The scars, the combat skills, the tattoo. Each piece of evidence was building a picture that was becoming impossible to deny. "I can't discuss my military service," she said carefully. "Some things are classified." "That's not a denial," Brad Kowalski pointed out, his earlier aggression replaced by something that might have been respect. "If you weren't a SEAL, you'd just say no." Jake Peterson was shaking his head in disbelief. "This is insane. Are you telling me that we were trying to intimidate an actual Navy SEAL? Like, someone who's probably killed people in combat?" Maya's expression didn't change, but her silence was answer enough. "Oh my God," Tyler breathed. "We're idiots. We're complete and total idiots." Marcus was nodding slowly, pieces of his father's stories suddenly making more sense. "My dad always told me that the most dangerous people are often the ones who don't need to prove anything. They're quiet because they're confident. They don't start fights because they know how fights end." So when she grabbed Brad's wrist, Connor began. "She was being gentle," Marcus finished. "She could have broken his arm without even trying." Brad flexed his fingers unconsciously, remembering the incredible pain that had shot through his arm when Maya had grabbed him. At the time, he had thought it was just a lucky pressure point strike. Now he was beginning to understand that it had been a controlled demonstration, a warning rather than an attack. "Why are you here?" Derek asked Maya. "I mean, if you're already a SEAL, why are you going through recruitment again?" Maya considered her answer carefully. The truth was complicated, involving a classified operation that had gone wrong, a medical discharge that had been reversed through political channels, and a new assignment that required her to blend in with regular recruits. But she couldn't explain any of that without revealing information that could compromise ongoing operations. "Sometimes people need to start over," she said finally. The cryptic response only added to the mystery, but before anyone could ask follow-up questions, Sergeant Rodriguez appeared with a clipboard and a stern expression. "Chun, Maya," he called out. "Report to Colonel Martinez's office immediately." Maya stood up smoothly, her movements attracting the attention of everyone in the room. As she walked toward the sergeant, the 9 recruits watched her with a mixture of awe, confusion, and newfound respect. "Should we wait for her?" Tommy asked the sergeant. "You'll be moving on to the next phase of processing," Sergeant Rodriguez replied curtly. "Miss Chun has some additional paperwork to complete." As Maya disappeared down the hallway with the sergeant, the 9 recruits were left to speculate about what was happening and what it might mean for their own military futures. Colonel Martinez's office was a study in military precision. Awards and commendations covered one wall, while the other displayed photographs of the colonel with various military and political leaders. Behind his desk sat a man in his 50s with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in uniform. "Petty Officer Chun," he said as Maya entered and came to attention. "Or should I say, former Petty Officer Chun." "Sir," Maya replied, maintaining her military bearing. "Relax," the colonel said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "This isn't a formal interview. I'm just trying to understand what you're doing in my recruitment center." Maya sat down but remained alert, unsure where this conversation was heading. "I have to admit," Colonel Martinez continued, "when I got the call from Dr. Hawkins about your scars, I was curious. So I made some phone calls. Do you know how many phone calls I had to make before someone would even acknowledge that you exist?" Maya didn't respond, but she wasn't surprised. Her service record was classified at levels that most military personnel would never encounter. 7 phone calls, the colonel continued. 7 calls before I finally reached someone at SOCOM who could confirm that Maya Chun is a real person with a real military background. Even then, all they would tell me is that you have been cleared for re-enlistment and that any questions about your service should be directed to Admiral Patterson's office. Maya's expression tightened slightly at the mention of Admiral Patterson. David Patterson was the Navy SEAL who had recruited her for special operations and had been her commanding officer for most of her classified missions. If he was involved in her current situation, it meant that this recruitment process was not what it appeared to be. "Here's what I find interesting," Colonel Martinez said, leaning back in his chair. "Admiral Patterson doesn't usually involve himself in routine recruitment matters. In fact, Admiral Patterson doesn't usually involve himself in anything that isn't related to special operations or national security. So either you're not who you appear to be, or this recruitment process isn't what it appears to be. Maya remained silent, but her mind was racing. She had been told that her new assignment would begin with a standard recruitment process, a way to establish her cover identity before moving on to her actual mission. But if Colonel Martinez was already asking questions and making calls to Sachem, then either the operation had been compromised or she was being tested in ways she hadn't anticipated.